Good evening, everybody. My name's Ryan, and I'm going to do another how-to video with you guys. It's the fall time here in Wisconsin. The leaves are turning, and like myself, most people are turning in their fishing gear for hunting gear. But one important part to making sure your fishing gear lasts a long time is the prep work and the maintenance that you do on it before winter rolls around. So today I'm going to show you how to clean and lube a bait caster. So here I have the Abu Garcia Revo SX, one of my favorite bait casters. This one was new to me, so I haven't really gone through it yet, but I want to go through it before the winter hits, tear it apart, get it all cleaned up and greased so I know it's ready to go for springtime fishing. Alright, so some of the things you're going to need for cleaning and lubing a bait caster is obviously, number one, you're going to need a bait caster. Number two, you're going to need some sort of cleaner. So I went with Slide on cycle. It's just basically a degreaser. Anything that breaks down grease will work fine. Stay away from brake cleaner or carb cleaner, anything that has any kind of aggressive chemicals in it, because it can ruin the components within the bait caster. So just stick with a simple degreaser and you should be good to go. You're going to need some simple tools. This is a jeweler's set. So this is just small screwdrivers like flatheads, Phillips, and then there's also a little tool that I have that'll help. I'll explain what it does, but it helps take the bait caster apart too. This is just a little 10 millimeter, you can call it a wrench. So you could use just a simple 10 millimeter wrench, which will be fine, but this tool came with a bait caster I purchased in the past, so I just keep it around for that. I also have some other screwdrivers, different sizes, small, bigger, depending on the bait caster. It can differ as to what size screws you're going to need to take apart. Another cleaning thing you're going to need is some Q-tips. This will help clean some of the small crevices. And then as far as your lubrication goes, I use Penn grease. So this is a thicker grease. This isn't a lube, but it's more of like a grease that you're gonna put on like your gears to reduce friction and reduce wear. And then you're gonna have some oil. So this is gonna be for like your bearings and other friction points that need constant lubrication at all times. This does say Lucas oil on it, but it's actually Penn oil. The reason I like it is because it came in a bottle with a very fine tip, so you can control how much oil is going into certain areas. If you over lube your bait caster, it'll actually cause more harm than good. And then any kind of paper toweling or a towel of some sort to kind of help you clean parts will be something that you're going to need as well. Alright, let's get started. So right away you're going to unclick the side panel lever. That's going to pull apart your brakes on the inside, and then you can slide your spool out. Then you're going to remove a screw on the locking collar that holds your handle on, just a little retainer screw. And then that tool I talked about earlier, that 10 millimeter tool, or you can use a wrench. You use that to loosen that nut. And just as a reminder, all that is reverse threaded. So you pull the handle off. Sometimes you got to put the spool back in order to get your drag star off. But you crank that off, and then you tip it upside down to make sure you don't lose any washers. And then from there you pull that spool back out. You can unscrew your spool tension knob, and then you're going to remove all the screws that hold on the other side of the bait caster. Inside that plastic covering is going to be where your drag system is, along with a lot of your gearing, so your main gear, your pinion gear, and everything like that. That's where the majority of your lubing and greasing is gonna happen. Sometimes it can be a pain to get the plate off. The screws sometimes will stick. So depending on how long the screws are, it'll dictate how hard it is to get off. But play with it a little bit, and it should come off fairly easy. Then you're going to pull off your main gear. and then you're going to pull off your pinion yoke and the springs. And then there's a little shaft inside your pinion yoke, and that is basically the full disassembly of the baitcaster. So then from there, I just start cleaning all the components. You can see where all the grease is and everything like that. You're gonna clean off your spool on each side, get any kind of grease that could be residual, and then add a couple drops of lubrication to your spool bearing. Spin that around, make sure the lube sets in, and that's done. Here you're gonna clean off the brakes. And there's a bearing in there too. You can see how dirty that gets. What happens is there's magnetic brakes in there, and as that rubs over time, that creates a lot of dust. So that's why it's important to clean this out and have that in tip-top shape, well clean and lubricated. So that half is done there. Then you're gonna break down your main gear, which is gonna have your lock washer, as well as your some fiber washers for your drag system. On the tension knob, there's a bearing in there. That's the bearing that your spool rides on. And then there's also a sleeve inside your drag shaft. So that's what I'm cleaning out now. So you clean the inside of that out. And then on the outside of that sleeve there's a bearing that meets up with that surface. So lube the inside of that, and you should be good there, because what'll happen is we'll go inside and you clean off the inside of that bearing like I'm doing now, and that's a roller bearing in there. The rest are ball bearings. So any other bearing on the baitcaster is going to be a ball bearing. Your drag shaft is going to be a roller bearing. So clean that off, throw a little bit of grease inside there. And that's the reason why I did not grease the outside of that sleeve, because you can put too much grease on a baitcaster. And then here I'm moving the bearing for the spool shaft. So here I'm removing a washer on your drag star, and then you just go in there and clean any residual stuff off. What I noticed when I took this baitcaster apart was there's a lot of oil and a lot of grease inside this. So you can see all the shiny surfaces. I don't generally like having all that in there. So that's why I'm cleaning it out and just being very diligent with the amount of lube and grease I'm putting on. So you break down your drag system on your main gear, take all your fiber washers out, and your ratcheting gear, as well as your pressure washer. Just wipe everything down because there's grease in between everything. They're not necessarily super dirty where you have to clean them really well, but for me, I have a preference to a specific grease, so I just like to try to get as much off as possible. And here I'm cleaning the teeth on the main gear. Like I said, trying to get as much grease as possible out so I can put my own grease that I prefer on my baitcasters. Here I'm cleaning off some washers that's also part of your drag system. Next I'm going to go into the pinion gear. There's a pinion gear and a pinion shaft. Go ahead and clean that out. There's a lot of grease that tends to be in there, and that is the gear that rides up against your main gear, so it's super important to have that clean and well greased. I don't tend to put a lot of grease on these components, especially the pinion yoke, which I'm cleaning right now. The reason behind that is because it somehow all seems to settle in that area because there's a lot of friction points and a lot of grease being moved throughout that area. If there's too much grease, it'll just collect contaminants and cause premature wear on your gearing, which leads to failure. And then you slowly just kind of make your way through. You see any loose washers, try to clean them up. You'll notice any grease that's sitting behind. The way a baitcaster is designed is, at some point as you're using the baitcaster, the grease on every component will make its way around, and it'll disperse throughout the baitcaster. So here you want to put a little bit of grease on your pinion gear as well as your pinion shaft. You don't want to be putting too much on because they can get messy and cause more problems. And then throw a little bit of grease on your pinion yoke. and go ahead and start assembling that together. You set that aside, and then your main gear, you can put a little bit of grease on the outside. It's not super important, but the reason I do it is for ease of assembly. So I put a little bit of grease on there just to prevent any kind of oxidation or rust, as well as when you go to put everything together, they all stick together, so you can slide it on as one piece. And then this is the part that I was a bit concerned about, is how much grease and oil and everything was just sitting in there. So this one took me a while to get cleaned out. You can see you have your drag gears. Those are loaded up quite a bit with grease, and then you can see the reflection, the shiny reflection on it. That's plastic. That backing is plastic, so it should be a relatively matte finish, maybe semi-gloss, but what I noticed is there was a ton of grease on that. Put a little bit of grease on your drag gear and spin that around, and you're all set. Now we can go ahead and start the final assembly. You're going to grab your 1/2 with all your gearing in it, your pinion, gear, shaft, and yoke, and you're going to throw that on there along with the springs. And then your whole drag system with main gear and pressure washer can all slide in. Make sure that pinion gear and that main gear mesh. And you can slide the other half on. And go ahead and drop your screws in to screw down that half of the baitcaster. Now, in this video I only use one screwdriver, and every baitcaster is different. And the reason I said to get the jeweler set is because you'll run into some baitcasters that have some very, very tiny screws or some really hard to reach odd screws, so that's why it's always smart to have that, hence the reason why I have mine. Then you're going to slide on your drag shaft sleeve, and then there's your click washer for your tension knob. You can hear that click, so you want to make sure that clicks good. If it doesn't, that means that washer's on wrong. Go ahead and slide your spool on, and then on this particular baitcaster there is a little kind of like a trap door that you can take a screw off and the little plastic cap will come off, and it's for quick lubrication on the fly. Next, you're going to want to put the other half of your baitcaster on. That half has your magnetic brakes in it, and then you're going to have your lever that's going to click down and lock that half into place. This one was giving me a little bit of issues putting that back together. Make sure everything's meshed together. There is a little pin on the outside of the spool that you got to make sure that drops into the pinion gear. There's a little notch in there, and it should all mesh together and spin together. And then basically once you get that snapped in, you can continue with your assembly. And then you start assembling your drag system. So that the drag washer goes on. There's 2 more washers inside the drag star, and then you start getting your drag star screwed on. And it can be kind of tough. It is reverse threaded and the threads are very fine, so it can be kind of finicky, but once it goes on, it's quite smooth. Now, as you're turning your drag star on, what can happen is it wants to spin, so it's going to want to spin your worm gear and your spool, so it's good to hold it all together with your finger so you can tighten up that drag star. And then you go ahead and reassemble your handle. Put that nut on, get it nice and snug. And then the locking collar, I'll put it on there. There's a little screw that holds that down, so I put the locking collar on and then I'll tighten or loosen it accordingly so I can get the screw on. And then you go ahead and tighten it up. And then from here, I like to give it a couple spins, make sure everything's functioning properly, there's nothing skipping, and you're all set. Thanks for joining me. I hope this video helps you keep your baitcaster clean, lubed, and ready for lots of years of fishing.